Background music off. This is Alistair McIntyre, After Virtue, Chapter 1, A Disquieting Suggestion. Imagine that the natural sciences were to suffer the effects of a catastrophe. A series of environmental disasters are blamed by the general public on the scientists. Widespread riots occur. Laboratories are burnt down. Physicists are lynched. Books and instruments are destroyed. Finally, a know-nothing political movement takes power and successfully abolishes science teaching in schools and universities, imprisoning and executing the remaining scientists. Later still, there is a reaction against this destructive movement, and enlightened people seek to revive science, although they have largely forgotten what it was. But all that they possess are fragments, a knowledge of experiments, detached from any knowledge of the theoretical context which gave them significance. Parts of theories unrelated either to the other bits and pieces of theory which they possess or to experiment. Instruments whose use has been forgotten. Half chapters from books, single pages from articles, not always fully legible because torn and charred. Nonetheless, all these fragments are re-embodied in a set of practices which go under the revived names of physics, chemistry, and biology. Adults argue with each other about the respective merits of relativity theory, evolutionary theory, and phlogiston theory, although they possess only a very partial knowledge of each. Children learn by heart the surviving portions of the periodic table and recite as incantations some of the theorems of Euclid. Nobody, or almost nobody, realizes that what they are doing is not natural science in any proper sense at all. For everything that they say and do conforms to certain canons of consistency and coherence, and those contexts which would be needed to make sense of what they are doing have been lost, perhaps irretrievably. In such a culture, men would use expressions such as neutrino, mass, specific gravity, atomic weight, in systematic and often interrelated ways which would resemble, in lesser or greater degrees, the ways in which such expressions had been used in earlier times before scientific knowledge had been so largely lost. But many of the beliefs presupposed by the use of these expressions would have been lost, and there would appear to be an element of arbitrariness and even of choice in their application, which would appear very surprising to us. What would appear to be rival and competing premises for which no further argument could be given would abound. Subjectivist theories of science would appear and would be criticized by those who held that the notion of truth embodied in what they took to be science was incompatible with subjectivism. This imaginary possible world is very like one that some science fiction writers have constructed. We may describe it as a world in which the language of natural science, or parts of it at least, continues to be used, but is in a grave state of disorder. We may notice that if in this imaginary world analytical philosophy were to flourish, it would never reveal the fact of this disorder. For the techniques of analytical philosophy are essentially descriptive, and descriptive of the language of the present at that. The analytical philosopher would be able to elucidate the conceptual structures of what was taken to be scientific thinking and discourse in the imaginary world in precisely the way that he elucidates the conceptual structures of natural science as it is. Nor again would phenomenology or existentialism be able to discern anything wrong, or the structures of intentionality would be what they are now. The task of supplying an epistemological basis for these false simulacra of natural science would not differ in phenomenological terms from the task as it is presently envisaged. A Husserl or a Merleau-Ponty would be as deceived as a Strawson or a Quine. What is the point of constructing this imaginary world inhabited by fictitious pseudoscientists and real, genuine philosophy? The hypothesis which I wish to advance is that in the actual world which we inhabit, the language of morality is in the same state of grave disorder as the language of natural science in the imaginary world which I just described. What we possess, if this view is true, are the fragments of a conceptual scheme, parts which now lack those contexts from which their significance derived. We possess, indeed, simulacra of morality. We continue to use many of the key expressions, but we have very largely, if not entirely, lost our comprehension, both theoretical and practical, of morality. But how could this be so? The impulse to reject the whole suggestion out of hand will certainly be very strong. Our capacity to use moral language, to be guided by moral reasoning, to define our transactions with others in moral terms is so central to our view of ourselves that even to envisage the possibility of our radical incapacity in these respects is to ask for a shift in our view of what we are and do, which is going to be difficult to achieve. But we do already know two things about the hypothesis which are initially important for us if we are to achieve such a shift in viewpoint. One is that philosophical analysis will not help us. In the real world, the dominant philosophies of the present, analytical or phenomenological, will be as powerless to detect the disorders of moral thought and practice as they were impotent before the disorders of science in the imaginary world. Yet the powerlessness of this kind of philosophy does not leave us quite resourceless. For a prerequisite, that's a terrible word, for a prerequisite for understanding the present disordered state of the imaginary world was to understand its history, a history that had to be written in three distinct stages. The first stage was that in which the natural sciences flourished, the second, that in which they suffered catastrophe, and the third, that in which they were restored in damaged and disordered form. Notice that this history, being one of damage, being one of decline and fall, is informed by standards. It is not an evaluatively neutral chronicle. The form of the narrative, the division into stages, presuppose standards of achievement and failure, of order and disorder. It is what Hegel called philosophical history, and what Collingwood took all successful historical writing to be. So that if we are to look for resources to investigate the hypothesis about morality, which I have suggested, however bizarre and improbable it may appear to you now, we shall have to ask whether we can find in the type of philosophy and history propounded by writers such as Hegel and Collingwood, very different from each other as they are, of course, resources which we cannot find in analytical or phenomenological philosophy. But this suggestion immediately brings to mind a crucial difficulty for my hypothesis. For one objection to the view of the imaginary world which I constructed, let alone to my view of the real world, is that the inhabitants of the imaginary world reached a point where they no longer realized the nature of the catastrophe which they had suffered. Yet surely an event of such striking world historical dimensions could not have been lost from view, so that it was both erased from memory and unrecoverable from historical records. And surely what holds of the fictitious world holds even more strongly of our own real world. If a catastrophe sufficient to throw the language and practice of morality into grave disorder had occurred, surely we should all know about it. It would indeed be one of the central facts of our history. Yet our history lies open to view, so it will be said, and no record of any such catastrophe survives. So my hypothesis must simply be abandoned. To this I must at the very least concede that it will have to be expanded. Yet unfortunately at the outset expanded in such a way as to render it, if possible, initially even less credible than before, for the catastrophe will have to have been of such a kind that it was not and has not been, except perhaps by a very few, recognized as a catastrophe. We shall have to look not for a few brief striking events whose character is incontestably clear, but for a much longer, more complex and less easily identified process, and probably one which by its very nature is open to rival interpretation. Yet the initial implausibility of this part of the hypothesis may perhaps be slightly lessened by another suggestion. History, by now, in our culture, means academic history, and academic history is less than 2 centuries old. Suppose it were the case that the catastrophe of which my hypothesis speaks had occurred before, or largely before, the founding of academic history, so that the moral and other evaluative presuppositions of academic history derived from the forms of the disorder which it brought about. Suppose, that is, that the standpoint of academic history is such that from its value-neutral viewpoint, moral disorder must remain largely invisible, or that the historian and what is true of the historian is characteristically true also of the social scientist, will be allowed to perceive by the canons and categories of his discipline, will be one morality succeeding another. 17th century Puritanism, 18th century hedonism, and Victorian work ethic, and so on. But the very language of order and disorder will not be available to him. If this were to be so, it would at least explain why what I take to be the real world and its fate has remained unrecognized by the academic curriculum. For the forms of the academic curriculum would turn out to be among the symptoms of the disaster, whose occurrence the curriculum does not acknowledge. Most academic history and sociology, the history of a Namier or a Hofstadter and the sociology of a Merton or a Lipset, are after all as far away from the historical standpoint of Hegel and Collingwood as most academic philosophy is from their philosophical perspective. It may seem to many readers that as I have elaborated my initial hypothesis, I have step by step deprived myself of very nearly all possible argumentative allies. But is not just this required by the hypothesis itself? For if the hypothesis is true, it will necessarily appear implausible, since one way of stating part of the hypothesis is precisely to assert that we are in a condition which almost nobody recognizes and which perhaps nobody at all can recognize fully. If my hypothesis appeared initially plausible, it would certainly be false. And at least if even to entertain this hypothesis puts me into an antagonistic stance, it is a very different antagonistic stance from that of, for example, modern radicalism. For the modern radical is as confident in the moral expression of his stances and consequently in the assertive uses of the rhetoric of morality as any conservative has ever been. Whatever else he denounces in our culture, he is certain that it still possesses the moral resources which he requires in order to denounce it. Everything else may be, in his eyes, in disorder, but the language of morality is in order, just as it is. That he too may be being betrayed by the very language he uses is not a thought available to him. It is the aim of this book to make that thought available to radicals, liberals, and conservatives alike. I cannot, however, expect to make it palatable, for if it is true, we are all already in a state so disastrous that there are no large remedies for it. Do not, however, suppose that the conclusion to be drawn will turn out to be one of despair. Angst is an intermittently fashionable emotion, and the misreading of some existentialist texts has turned despair itself into a kind of psychological nostrum. But if we are indeed in as bad a state as I take us to be, pessimism too will turn out to be one more cultural luxury that we shall have to dispense with in order to survive in these hard times. I cannot, of course, deny, indeed my thesis entails, that the language and the appearances of morality persist, even though the integral substance of morality has to a large degree been fragmented and then in part destroyed. Because of this, there is no inconsistency in my speaking, as I shall shortly do, of contemporary moral attitudes and arguments. I merely pay to the present the courtesy of using its own vocabulary to speak of it. I hope that wasn't too long for you. Okay, so that's Alistair McIntyre and this text called After Virtue. And let me just, one second, I've got a little, okay. So yeah, Alistair McIntyre, this text After Virtue, in which he basically claims that there's a radical genealogical break, much in the same way that Nietzsche claims that good and bad are turned into good and evil on the genealogy of morals. And in fact, it turns out that McIntyre later in the text uses Nietzsche as part of his inspiration for this, although he also finds Nietzsche to be deeply, deeply problematic. But yeah, he has this kind of interesting thesis. The first time I ever encountered this kind of account of philosophy trying to say something like, there's a framework of thinking that you live in that might be so hidden from you, the assumptions built into it so hidden from you that you can't even notice them. And so it kind of pointed to this really strange kind of trap that you can get into when reasoning, that, you know, that you can always be caught by your own assumptions, particularly the ones that you don't even think of as being assumptions, that you think of as kind of just being the facts of the world. And I think it must have, well, I know it did. I know it made me think, wow, there's something really interesting in philosophy here, even though, as you probably got from the text, it's not a terribly inspiring text. It's just presenting this kind of thought experiment in a quite dry academic way. But it was this kind of moment of break that philosophy offered there, and the text offered, that was in itself kind of, you know, telling you how caught up you were inside the language, that I think was really interesting for me, and actually part of the way in which, you know, part of my movement away from moral theory myself.